Over the past 3 days, the Ukraine has been at the very epicenter of discussions at the Munich Security Conference. This annual MSC often fleshes out Western defense policies. Interestingly enough, this year, the Ukrainian President Zelensky was there, although there had been some rumors that he wouldn't leave his country and go to Germany. But also, interestingly enough, President Putin of Russia was not there. Now, a lot of people have already spoken. Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and many others, from the EU officials to the Secretary General of the United Nations. But the one person whose speech, whose address to the MSC caught my attention more than others perhaps, was that of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Why? Because he made a few points that I personally thought were relevant, and they spoke to me. He said, he reminded the people assembled in the hall that diplomacy should not be naive. In other words, we should basically do the possible, not stretch out to the improbable. He also spoke about the EU role. And that is major, that is key in this whole debacle about what is happening in the Ukraine with Russia, because people are asking, well, where are the 27 of the EU, and do they have a united foreign policy perspective? He also spoke about the fact that we're no more in a Cold War situation, nor are we in a one superpower situation, but that we're now in a multipolar world. And I believe that is quite true. He added that in his opinion, Russia was open, still open to diplomacy. And he hinted, albeit not explicitly, that there are negotiations that are being conducted in the public eye. But there are also many negotiations, as is often the case in politics, that are being conducted below the radar. And he also hinted at, I think, but that's something I've also mentioned in the past, and I think it's quite relevant to this conflict in some ways, the Cuban crisis in the 1960s. When there was again a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, but this time not far away in Europe, but pretty much at the doorstep of the United States. So with that little intro, let me welcome you to Intuitive Reactions number 38, and it is, as you know, focused on the MENA and Gulf regions. Today, I would like to explore with you very briefly on the crisis in the Ukraine, and more importantly, from our perspective in this YouTube, on its impact, on its putative impact on the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf regions. Now, you will have noticed that already the conversation has shifted. It is no longer only in theoretical terms. We're not only talking about what if this and what if that, but there is already a lot of shelling and a lot of tension and some violence that is already taking place in Luhansk and in Donetsk, in the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. Now, this is a region that Russia pretty much freed in 2014, and it is now, in the eyes of the Ukrainian government, occupied territory, and in the eye of the people there who are primarily supportive of Russia and Russian presence, they are separatists from the Ukraine. Now, this region is an agricultural region. It's also an industrial hub. And I'm just wondering, as the first thought that I offer you here today, is it possible that this could become this region, the Donetsk and Luhansk areas, the whole Donbass region? Could it become a face-saving formula to get out of an all-out war? Is that possible? After all, you do recall, don't you, that the Duma, the Russian parliament, has passed a proposal, a bill that basically says that Russia should officially annex this region to the motherland. It's on the piece of paper is on President Putin's desk, but as far as I know, he hasn't acted on it yet. But there are also many indications that there are well over 50,000 passports, Russian passports, that have been granted to the people who are living in this region. And that is why now that region has become pretty much a litmus test of what happens next. Now, there are others who've also told me in private conversations we've had over a drink that, Harry, keep an eye on Odessa. Now, it's interesting because Odessa is much more famous than Luhansk and Donetsk for people outside the Ukraine or outside the region because of its touristic and resort attractions. It's on the western shore of the Ukraine. And if you can imagine the map, then you have Crimea, which was also in 2014 taken by Russia in the middle. And then you have the Donbass region in the east. And of course, now the Western narrative has shifted to one of democracy. We must support and protect democracy in Ukraine, although, to be honest with you, the way democracy is fashioned out in the Ukraine, the way the President Zelensky, who came to power with a whole long list of promises for reform, have not really materialized, and he shifted directions. Democracy versus corruption has been something that I've been hearing a lot over the years, not recently, in the Ukraine. Now, what is the key problem? The key problem, according to a lot of commentators, and we have lots and lots and lots of pundits and journalists in the region, is that Russia feels let down by the West because Gorbachev and NATO were far more sympathetic and supportive of NATO. In fact, Yeltsin, I believe, wanted in some way to join NATO, and that the West, Russia claims, Putin claims, had promised that NATO will not spread into East Europe, into what were the former Soviet socialist republics. Therefore, Russia accuses the West of deception, and the cup brimmeth, as it were, for Russia, or so says its public relations, and hence we have this conflict. But it's very interesting. One of the links that I will put in the description box is by Mark Galleoti, who suggests in his podcast entitled In Moscow's Shadow that it could well be that if there is a conflict, it's going to boomerang badly on Russia and on Putin as well, and that we might actually see a return to the Brezhnev era and a senescent Putin reign with increasingly less economic and soft power for Russia globally. I don't know whether that is true, but also in the description box, you will see another very, very interesting article. I found it interesting personally, by Volodymyr Ishchenko. He's a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And he basically talks about the three scenarios for the Ukraine-Russia crisis. I would very much encourage you to click on that link and read it. Now, This is a very, very simplified and some would say simple-minded overview of where we have been in this increasing tempo of the conflict and the confrontation between the West and Russia over the Ukraine. But don't forget that this YouTube is on the MENA and Gulf regions. And countries in this region or in these regions are being watchful and cautious because a potential war could well affect vital food supplies, global energy routes, and regional stability in that region. So no wonder, in my opinion, that Israel has been extremely careful, and I would even say mum about this conflict, because it does not want to upset the Russians, whilst at the same time it wants to remain the American favorite ally. And many Arab countries have tried to stay out of the fray too. There aren't many comments or statements coming out of Israel or the Arab world. So here I would like to propose to you some elements that I simply offer to you for consideration. The first one, the military component insofar as the MENA and Gulf regions are concerned. Let's take Libya as a case in point. Could, for instance, if there is a war and Putin wants to destabilize the region or wants to get his own back at the West for supporting Ukraine's president and regime, could Russia mobilize the Al Jufra military base that it maintains in Libya? Could it play the refugee game in the way that it has happened on the Poland-Byelorussian border? We all know how sensitive the EU is about refugees coming into the European mainland. Let's take Syria, again on the military aspect. Russia maintains a naval port and an air base in the city of Tartus. And its presence there allows or hinders access to refugee and humanitarian supplies. Could Russia play a mischievous game there? And another question, again on the military side, the reverse of that. What if there is a conflict? And what if Turkey, as a NATO country on the southern flank, closes off the Bosphorus? That would put a lot of pressure on Putin when there are about 150, 160, even more, according to some observers, troops and military arsenal there. Would this mean that Putin would withdraw from Syria if the Ukraine situation deteriorates for him, if it becomes a kind of a reminder of a mini Afghanistan? I personally don't think that he will, but there are people who are actually mooting this point. Now, from the military, I would go to food supplies. Wheat. Wheat is very important. Now, the Ukraine is dubbed the breadbasket of Europe. And according to S&P Global, both the Ukraine and Russia provide some 23% of global wheat exports. Others, both globally and to the MENA and Gulf regions, are Algeria and Norway, that are also major suppliers. Now, as you might also know, the Ukraine exports 95% of its grain through the Black Sea, and more than 50% of its wheat exports go to the Middle East and North Africa region. At least that was what the figures showed for 2020. Now, Egypt, Lebanon, as well as, say, Libya, Syria, and Yemen are reliant on this import of wheat. Think if there is a disruption, what would happen to the prices and how that would impact on the region. Then, military, food supplies, primarily I would think of wheat, energy in the Arabian Peninsula, the oil and gas supplies on the one hand and arms sales on the other. This is why when the Emir of Qatar was in Washington, D.C., President Biden really rolled out the red carpet, made him an unofficial partner for NATO. And part of that is in recognition, or was in recognition of Qatar's major help in making sure that the Afghan catastrophe, the disaster, the debacle, didn't become even worse when it basically mobilized its resources, its contacts, its planes to help the United States and some Western countries to take their expatriate people out. I mean, that it was part of the recognition, but the other part was that Qatar has huge amounts of liquefied natural gas, LNG. But this gas is usually contracted also on a long-term basis. And in Qatar's case, I think it's by India and South Korea. But Qatar might still be interested in the backing of the United States. And therefore, short-term supplies of LNG might actually also come from Qatar to the West in case there is a disruption of the supply. And this is why so much pressure is being put on the German Chancellor. There was the same kind of pressure on his predecessor, Angela Merkel, to threaten ditching the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But Germany has resisted. So I personally do not think that Qatar could actually step in and compensate all of Russian gas supply to Europe, but I think it could play a role in the short time, in the hope that things develop and move forward in a positive sense. And so after the military, the wheat and the energy, let me conclude on security. And here, when I said that Israel is keeping mum, why? Part of the reason, not entirely, of course, because Israel, by the way, has very good relations with Russia, is because Israel is targeting proxy bases in Syria all the time. And Russian troops have been turning pretty much a blind eye. Imagine if that stops, what will happen to Israeli incursions and attacks on bases and proxy bases in Syria. Also, think in terms of Saudi Arabia's dominance of OPEC and oil has been in partnership with Russia. Besides, do you recall that Saudi Arabia and Russia signed a military cooperation agreement in August last year? Therefore, being forced to pick a side between Russia and the US could turn to be a real dilemma. Now, a few days ago, and in fact, even a couple of weeks ago, but again, a few days ago, I was talking to friends and we were saying, will there be a war? Won't there be a war? And I was of the opinion that there will not be a war, that these are tactical moves that at the very last minute, and this is how negotiations sometimes happen, particularly in view of what I told you of below the radar negotiations, that something will happen to stop us all falling into a detrimental, huge and unfortunate war. In the last couple of days, I'm beginning to worry that we might actually witness a war. Its limitations, its terrain, I'm not too sure of at the moment, but I am concerned because sometimes we might not be able to stop and row back if we go forward too vehemently and with too much bombasm and too much military ostentation. So let's hope, let's really hope, because at the end of the day, I doubt that many people who are listening to this YouTube would wish to witness a war. And most importantly, the people living in the Ukraine, they don't deserve a war, the ordinary citizens, the ordinary men, children, and women. They do not deserve it. So let's hope for the best. And let's hope it doesn't happen not only for global peace and security, but also, as I said, because of the impact and the repercussions on the MENA and Gulf regions. Take care and have yourselves a nice Sunday and a hopeful week ahead.